The woman wouldn't stop crying, and that was the problem. Not because Sloane Mercer lacked sympathy, she had plenty of it. But when a client cries in the middle of a flower consultation at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, it usually means the wedding is about to be called off, and that meant 3 months of work. The peonies sourced from a farm in Oregon, the jasmine vines she'd negotiated at cost, the hand-tied centerpieces she'd already sketched twice, was about to become somebody else's problem or nobody's at all. Sloane set her clipboard down on the edge of the consultation table and handed the woman a tissue with the calmness of someone who had done this before. Because she had. 17 times, in fact. She kept a quiet count. "Take your time," she said. The woman, Rebecca, 42, mother of the bride, took a shuddering breath and pressed the tissue to the corners of her eyes without smearing her mascara, which told Sloane she was the kind of woman who had been crying in public for long enough to have developed a technique. "She changed the color scheme again," Rebecca said. "To what?" "Burgundy." Sloane looked at the sample boards pinned to the wall behind her. Blush, ivory, sage, 4 months of refinement. "All right," she said, "burgundy works." Rebecca stared at her. "You're not upset? The flowers don't care what color they are. The flowers just want to be beautiful." It wasn't the most profound thing Sloane had ever said. But Rebecca laughed, a surprised and real laugh, the kind that costs something, and for the next 40 minutes they rebuilt the palette from scratch. By the time Rebecca left, she was clutching a new swatch booklet, and the expression of someone who had been talked off a ledge by someone who made it look easy. Sloane stood at the window of Calloway Floral and watched the woman cross the street, and then she let out a long breath she hadn't known she was holding. "You're a miracle worker," said Penny from behind the counter. Penny Oakes was 24, kept her hair in 2 braids that somehow still looked professional, and had been Sloane's assistant for 2 years. She said this kind of thing often enough that Sloane had learned to appreciate it and distrust it in equal measure. "I'm a florist," Sloane said. "You're a florist who just rebuilt a $14,000 centerpiece order in under an hour without billing for the consultation change. The flowers don't care about billing either. The electricity bill does." "Fair point." Sloane took her clipboard back and looked at the afternoon schedule. A delivery to the Harrington Hotel at 2, a walkthrough at the venue on 5th at 4, and at 6 the preview event for the Whitmore Center's Spring Gala. A charity affair Calloway Floral had been contracted to decorate for the past 3 years, which meant Sloane would spend the evening checking that the centerpieces hadn't shifted in transit, and that nobody had moved the orchid installations she'd spent 2 days positioning to the inch. It was going to be a long day. What she didn't know was that it was going to be the kind of long day that rearranges things. The Harrington delivery went smoothly. The venue walkthrough did not. The coordinator had changed the table layout without telling anyone, which meant Sloane spent 40 minutes on her phone recalculating runner lengths while standing in the middle of a ballroom that smelled like fresh paint and someone else's bad planning. She arrived at the Whitmore Center at 5:45 with grass stains on her left shoe and the expression of someone who was going to be professional about it. The Whitmore Center occupied 3 floors of a building in the Arts District that had once been a printing factory. High ceilings, exposed ductwork, windows that ran floor to ceiling along the east wall and looked out over the city's modest skyline. At 6 in the evening, the light came through at a low angle and turned everything gold for about 20 minutes, which was the only reason Sloane had agreed to this particular start time for 3 years running. Those 20 minutes, the orchids, the long oak tables, it worked. She knew it worked because people stopped talking when they walked in, and that was the only metric that mattered. She was adjusting a vase on the far end of the 3rd table when she heard the voice. "The arrangement on the left is off by about 3 inches. Sloane didn't turn. She adjusted the vase another 1/4 inch in the direction the voice had indicated, decided it was better, and then turned. The man standing 6 feet away was not a Whitmore Center staff member. He was wearing a jacket that cost more than her monthly rent and holding a glass of water that the event hadn't technically started serving yet, which meant he'd asked for it specifically, and someone had given it to him without question. Late 30s, dark hair, the kind of posture that doesn't announce itself but fills whatever space it's standing in. "It was off by 2 inches, Sloane said. "Not 3. He looked at the vase. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted in a way that was hard to categorize. Not quite a smile, not quite surprise. "Fair enough," he said. "Are you on the guest list or are you an advance scout?" "Both, I suppose." He extended a hand. "Gideon Hale." Sloane shook it. "Sloane Mercer. I did the flowers. I noticed. Most people don't. Most people aren't looking for the right things." She held his gaze for a moment. direct, taking his time, the kind of look that didn't have anything to prove. Then she picked up her clipboard and turned back to the table. "The water isn't being served until 6:15, she said. "I know. I asked early. They should have said no. They should have," he agreed, without the slightest indication that he found this troubling. Sloane filed him away, moved to the next table. The gala was the kind of event that hummed at a frequency designed to make everyone feel slightly underdressed and slightly too important at the same time. Sloane circulated with her clipboard and her radio, checked in with the catering lead, confirmed the second orchid installation hadn't been touched, and answered 4 questions about whether the white arrangements could be moved closer to the entrance. The answer was no, and she said it each time with the pleasantness of someone who had stopped being surprised by the question. It was during her second pass through the main hall that she walked into a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. The side corridor off the east hall was used for staging, extra linens, backup centerpieces, the coat rack that hadn't made it to the right floor yet. Sloane took it as a shortcut to the service door, and she was halfway through when she caught the tail end of 2 voices from the alcove around the corner. "Hale's already watching her, told you. He has a type. Competent, keeps her head down, doesn't know who he is." A low laugh. "How long before she finds out the center is on the acquisition list?" "Long enough for him to decide she's useful." "You're terrible." "I'm accurate." 20 says she's gone from the contract before the gala season ends. He cycles through vendors when he restructures, personal interest or not. Sloane stood very still in the corridor for 2 full seconds. Then she moved on because standing still in hallways was something other people did. She spent the next 40 minutes doing her job with complete professionalism, which meant nobody would have known anything had changed. She checked the installations. She coordinated the breakdown timeline with the event manager. She thanked the Whitmore Center's director of programs for the 3rd year of partnership in the tone of someone who was entirely present and entirely fine. She was not entirely fine. She was calculating. The acquisition list was not a small piece of information. Calloway Floral had held the Whitmore Center contract for 3 years. The Whitmore Center was 12% of their annual revenue. If the building changed ownership and the new management restructured vendor relationships, which new ownership almost always did, that 12% walked out the door, and Gideon Hale had introduced himself to her before the event started, not after before. Sloane knew the difference. Penny was still at the shop when Sloane got back at 9:15, because Penny treated closing time as a suggestion on event nights. "How'd it go?" "The orchids held," Sloane said. She set her bag on the counter and started unwrapping her scarf. "Do you know anything about a Gideon Hale?" Penny looked up from the register. "Hale Properties?" "Apparently, Sloane." Penny set down the tape gun. "Hale Properties owns 6 buildings in this city. They bought the Renwick Tower last year and turned over every single vendor contract within 4 months." "I know. Do you know him?" "We spoke briefly." Penny stared at her with the expression of someone doing rapid mental arithmetic. "Did he know who you were before you spoke?" Sloane thought about the 20-minute window, the vase, the water he'd asked for early. "I think so. That's either very good or very bad. I know that too." She drove home with the windows down despite the cold because she needed the air to think, and she thought best when something physical was happening. By the time she pulled into her street, she had arrived at a conclusion she didn't particularly like but couldn't argue with. She had no information, and no information was worse than bad information, and the only thing to do about that was to get some. The message came the next morning. Not through the Whitmore Center's event coordination system, which was how Gideon Hale should have reached her if this were a professional matter. It came directly to Calloway Floral's email, the general address, which meant he'd looked it up, with a short line that said he was reviewing vendor relationships for the Whitmore Center ahead of a potential ownership transition, and he'd like to meet Thursday if that worked. Sloane read it twice, replied once. "Thursday works." 10 a.m. Penny read over her shoulder. "You're going?" "He already knows something's going on," Sloane said. "The last thing I'm going to do is change my behavior because the landlord showed up." Penny was quiet for 3 seconds. "You're either very strategic or completely calm about this. Depends on the day." Thursday was overcast, the kind of gray that made the city look like it was being photographed in black and white. Sloane arrived at the address Gideon had sent, a building in the financial district with lobby furniture that cost more than her van, at 9:52. She checked in at reception. She was led to a conference room on the 14th floor with a view of the river, low and silver under the clouds. Gideon was already there, standing, not sitting, looking out at the water with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, which was the first indication that the meeting was going to be different from what she'd expected. He turned when she came in. "Sloane, thank you for coming. You have a good view. The river's better in the morning. You're almost on time. I'm 8 minutes early." "I've been here 40, he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested this was not unusual for him. "Sit down." She sat. He remained standing for a moment, as if he hadn't decided yet, and then he sat across from her. He had a folder in front of him and he didn't open it. "I'll be direct," he said. "Please, Hale Properties is in final negotiations to acquire the Whitmore Center. That transaction will close, barring anything unexpected, within 90 days. When it does, we'll be reviewing all existing vendor contracts as part of a broader operational assessment." Sloane kept her eyes on him. "And Calloway Floral is on that list. Every vendor is on that list." He paused. "But you're one of 3 I reached out to personally. Why?" He opened the folder then, finally. Pushed a page across the table. It was a report, event photographs, attendance data, post-event survey results from the Whitmore Center's last 4 galas. The florist's satisfaction rating was in the upper right corner, circled in pen, 97 out of 100. 3 years running, Gideon said. "That's not a coincidence. That's a standard." Sloane looked at the page. She had never seen this report. She hadn't known it existed. "What do you want from this meeting?" she asked. "A conversation." He leaned back slightly. "I want to understand how you work, what you prioritize, whether Calloway Floral is built to scale or built to stay small." The question was reasonable. It was also a test, and she knew it, and he likely knew that she knew it. "Calloway Floral is built to do excellent work," she said. "It currently does that work at a size that allows me to maintain the standard you just pointed to. If I scaled carelessly, that number goes down. I'm not interested in that trade." Gideon looked at her for a moment. "Most vendors in your position try to convince me they can handle anything. I'm not most vendors." "No," he agreed. "You're not." The meeting lasted 45 minutes and covered more ground than she'd anticipated. Sourcing relationships, lead times, crisis protocols, the question of what she did when a client changed the brief 3 days before an event. She answered everything directly and didn't oversell a single thing. When she stood to leave, she paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes, you reached out to me personally, not through the center's event management system, not through a standard vendor review process." She held his gaze. "Why?" Gideon didn't look away. Something in his expression did what it had done at the gala. That shift that wasn't quite a smile but was something adjacent to it. "Because the center uses 12 vendors. 11 of them sent me the same boilerplate response when I introduced myself at the preview. You didn't know who I was, and you told me the water service hadn't started yet." Sloane let that sit for a moment. "I knew who you were by the end of the night. I know, and you still reached out the next morning." "Yes." She picked up her bag. "I'll wait to hear from your team on the formal review." "You will," he said. "But this wasn't the formal review." She left. And she spent the drive back to the shop working out why a 45-minute conversation with a man who held her contract in his hands had felt less like a negotiation and more like the beginning of something she hadn't agreed to yet. 2 weeks passed. They were professional weeks, in that she heard nothing from Hale Properties, and the Whitmore Center continued to process her invoices on their usual net 30 cycle, which meant either the acquisition hadn't closed yet or it had and nothing had changed yet. Both were possible. Neither told her anything useful. What she did have was a call from the center's director, a woman named Audra, who mentioned in passing that the new ownership had been in contact and seemed very interested in the spring gala. "Did they say anything about vendors?" Sloane asked, in the tone of someone asking about something mildly interesting. "Not specifically," Audra said, "but they asked a lot of questions about you, which I found notable." Sloane found it notable too. She filed it away. The next time she saw Gideon Hale, it was not a meeting. It was a Monday morning, and she was at the wholesale flower market on Crane Street, pushing a flat cart through the ranunculus aisle at 7:15 in the morning. Wearing her work jacket with the Calloway Floral logo on the chest and her hair in a knot that had stopped being intentional sometime around 6:45. He was standing at the end of the aisle looking at dahlias the way people look at things they find genuinely interesting but don't have context for. No jacket. A jacket that cost less than the one she'd seen before. Still more than hers, but different. He looked for the first time like a slightly more ordinary version of himself. She stopped the cart. He hadn't seen her yet. She pushed the cart forward. "The white ones won't hold past Friday if you're buying for an event," she said without slowing. He turned. The expression on his face when he recognized her had a half-second of something unguarded in it. and then the composure returned, but she'd seen the half-second. "I'm not buying," he said. "I'm looking. People don't come to wholesale at 7 a.m. to look. I was in the neighborhood." Sloane glanced at the building directory she knew from memory. The nearest Hale Properties office was 11 blocks north. "Were you?" "I had an early meeting," he said. "And then I walked 11 blocks." He looked at her without answering, which was itself an answer. Sloane pulled a stem of white ranunculus off the rack, checked the underside, put it back, selected a different one. "The dahlias in this row are end-of-season imports. If you want something that'll last, the cafe dahlias 2 rows over are better." "I wasn't." "I know you weren't buying. I'm telling you anyway." She moved the cart forward. He fell into step beside her without being asked, which should have been presumptuous and somehow wasn't. They walked the market for 20 minutes. She selected and he observed, and at some point the conversation became about things other than flowers. The building the market occupied, which had once been a cold storage warehouse, the way cities found second uses for spaces that had been built for a different century. He talked about buildings the way she talked about arrangements, like they were alive, like they had intentions. "You see buildings as stories," she said, pulling a bundle of eucalyptus from the rack. "Doesn't everyone?" "No, most people see buildings as addresses." He took that in for a moment. "You see flowers as what?" "Decisions," she said. "Every arrangement is a set of decisions. What to say, what to leave out, how to make the person looking at it feel something they didn't come in expecting to feel." He looked at her for a long moment, the way he'd looked at the dahlias, like something that required attention. "Hale Properties has a property in the warehouse district," he said. "Former textile factory. We're converting it into event space. I have an architect who understands structure and a designer who understands aesthetics, and neither of them understands what happens when people actually walk into a room." Sloane stopped the cart. "You're asking me to consult. I'm asking if you'd be willing to walk through it. That's the same thing." "Not yet, it isn't." She looked at him. He was standing in the ranunculus aisle of a wholesale flower market at 7:30 in the morning with no particular reason to be there that held up to examination. And he was looking at her the same way he'd looked at the gala centerpieces, like someone who had learned to recognize quality and found it in an unexpected place. "When?" she said. "Saturday morning. Send me the address." He did, and that was the end of the market encounter. Except that Penny called at noon because the wholesale supplier had flagged the order as unusually large, and when Sloane explained she'd added extra eucalyptus and cafe dahlias on a professional instinct. Penny gave a long pause and said, "This wouldn't have anything to do with the man from the Whitmore Gala, would it?" "Absolutely not," Sloane said, and put her on a different task. Saturday was clear and cold. The textile factory on Millhouse Street still had its original brick, which had been cleaned to a warm orange-brown that caught the morning light in a way that made Sloane stop on the sidewalk for a moment before going in. Gideon was inside with a set of blueprints and a man in a safety vest who turned out to be the site manager. He introduced them, and the site manager gave her a hard hat and said the floors were solid but the second level hadn't been cleared yet. She put on the hard hat without comment. They spent 90 minutes in the building. She walked the main floor and said that the original support columns were a problem if you wanted open sightlines but an asset if you embraced them, which was a choice the architect hadn't yet made. She looked at the east wall and said the window bank was the best thing in the building, and whoever had proposed covering it with a partition wall should be asked to reconsider. She stood in the middle of the future event space and said the acoustics were going to be an issue and that whoever was advising on sound should walk it before the ceiling went in. Gideon wrote nothing down. He watched her with the expression of someone who had expected to learn something and was learning more than anticipated. "You speak like someone who's moved through a lot of rooms," he said. "I've set up events in more venues than I can count. You learn what works and what wastes everyone's time. It's more than that." He was standing by the east windows, the light coming in sideways. "You understand how people feel in spaces, not just how they look. Feeling and looking are connected," she said. "Most people don't figure that out until they've already built the partition wall." He almost smiled. Almost. The same way he'd almost smiled at the gala. On the way out, the site manager asked Gideon something about the timeline for structural sign-off, and Sloane took the moment to look back at the building. The light, the brick, the original factory floor that had been walked by workers for 100 years, and still had the worn-in quality of something that had held a purpose. She thought about what it would look like in February, set for an evening event, the east windows dark against the city outside and the space lit from within. It would be extraordinary. if someone made the right decisions. She was putting the hard hat back on the site manager's table when Gideon appeared beside her. "I'd like your observations in writing," he said. "If you're willing, that's a consultation, yes. I charge for those." "I know," he said. "I'll have the contract to you by Monday." She left without further comment, and she spent the drive home trying to decide whether what was happening was a professional opportunity, a complication, or both, and the honest answer was that it was both. And she was going to have to hold that without flinching. The contract arrived Monday as promised. It was thorough, fair, and had a scope of work she hadn't expected to find already outlined in the details she would have asked for herself, which told her something about how he prepared for things. She signed it. She sent it back. The Whitmore Center's spring gala was 6 weeks out when the email arrived from the center's new property management contact. A name she didn't recognize from a Hale Properties address, with a subject line that read, "Vendor Contract Review, Calloway Floral." Sloane opened it. Read it again. The email was cordial. It requested documentation she'd already submitted once to Audra's office. It outlined a new vendor assessment process being implemented across all Hale-managed properties. It mentioned that contract renewals would be processed through the new system. None of that was the problem. The problem was the last paragraph, which said that the Whitmore Center Spring Gala was under review as part of a broader event strategy assessment, and that all event vendor roles were considered provisional pending that review. Provisional. For a contract she'd held for 3 years. She forwarded the email to Penny. Penny called in 4 minutes. "What does this mean?" "It means someone in their property management division sent a standard vendor review form, without knowing that I'm already under a separate consulting contract with Gideon Hale. Or someone in their property management division sent it knowing exactly that," Penny said, with the careful tone of someone who didn't want to alarm anyone but was alarmed. Sloane sat with that for a moment. "I'll call Audra." Audra was sympathetic and confused in approximately equal measure. She hadn't known about the vendor review email. She thought the gala was proceeding as normal. She said she'd follow up with the new property management contact. "Do you know who sent it?" Sloane asked. "Someone named Craig Denton. He was brought on as director of property operations last month. I've met him twice." A pause. "He came to the preview event, actually. The gala in February, where Sloane had been adjusting centerpieces, where Gideon had told her the arrangement on the left was off by 2 inches, where 2 people in an alcove off the East Hall had been talking about vendor cycles." Sloane made a mental note. She kept it to herself. She sent one email. To Gideon's direct address, not the general Hale Properties contact. Short, "I received a vendor review notice for the Whitmore Center Gala from Craig Denton. I wanted to make sure you're aware given the existing consulting arrangement. The reply came in under an hour. I wasn't aware. Thank you for flagging. I'll look into it." 3 words, which in the context of a man who chose his words the way she chose her flowers meant something. The following Monday, she arrived at the shop to find Penny holding a message with the expression of someone who had information and was deciding whether to deliver it at full strength or in stages. "The Whitmore Center called," Penny said. "Audra, the gala contract is confirmed. Standard renewal." The vendor review email was, quote, an administrative error. An administrative error. That's what she said. Sloane put her bag on the counter. "And Craig Denton?" Penny placed the message down. "Reassigned to a different property portfolio. Effective last Friday." Sloane stood at the counter for a moment, looking at the morning order list without seeing it. Gideon had handled it. Quietly, completely, and before she'd had to ask twice. That afternoon he called. Not emailed. "Called. I wanted to follow up directly," he said. "Penny told me. The gala's confirmed." "Yes." A pause. Craig misread the scope of his role and applied a blanket process where it didn't apply. "It's been corrected. He was at the February preview," Sloane said without making it a question. A brief silence. "He was. He would have seen you talk to me." "Yes." Gideon's voice was even. "He had some assumptions about how I make decisions about vendor relationships. He was wrong. Was he completely wrong?" The question landed in the silence between them like something physical. "No," Gideon said, "not completely. But the assumptions he made from that weren't ones I authorized." Sloane leaned against the counter. The afternoon light was coming through the shop window, catching the white blooms she'd pulled from the cold case that morning, turning them almost luminous. "I appreciate that you moved quickly," she said. "I should have anticipated it," he said. "When I reached out to you the way I did, through the shop's general email, early someone in my organization was going to read that as a signal. I should have been more careful about what signals I was sending." "Were you?" "Was I what?" "Sending signals." Another pause. Longer. the kind that had weight to it. "I was interested in your work," he said finally. "I told myself that was the only thing. I'm not certain that was entirely accurate." Sloane looked out the window. A woman walked past with a stroller and a very serious expression. A cab stopped at the corner and stayed too long. "I'm going to need the Whitmore contract to be based entirely on the work," she said. "Not on anything else. That has to be clear." "It is clear," he said. "To me. It needs to be clear to everyone in your organization. It will be good." She straightened up from the counter. "Then I'll see you at the site walkthrough on Wednesday, he said. "Yes." She hung up. She stood in the middle of the shop for a moment with the afternoon light making everything gold the way it sometimes did when the clouds arranged themselves just right. She'd said what she needed to say. It had been heard. What happened next was up to the work. The textile factory walkthrough on Wednesday lasted 2 hours. Sloane brought 3 pages of written observations and a sample board she hadn't been asked for but had put together anyway, because ideas were easier to discuss when people could see them. The architect, a woman named Petra who turned out to be funny and extremely direct about load-bearing walls, received the sample board with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this conversation. Gideon watched the two of them work through the spatial logic of the East Wing and said very little, which she had learned was how he operated when things were going the way he wanted them to go. At the end of the walkthrough, Petra said, "You should hire her to consult on the Meridian Street building too." "I'm aware," Gideon said. "I'm standing here," Sloane said. "I know," Petra said. "That's why I said it." March moved the way March does in a city that can't decide if it's still winter, cold in the morning, tentatively warm by afternoon, raining by evening with no warning. The textile factory project moved forward in weekly increments, and Sloane found herself building something she hadn't expected to build. A rhythm with Gideon that existed on the edge of professional and never quite crossed it, not because either of them was avoiding it, but because they were both, for their own reasons, careful. He called on Tuesdays to discuss the project. She emailed her observations on Thursdays. Sometimes the Tuesday calls lasted 45 minutes and covered ground that had nothing to do with load-bearing walls or event flow. She learned that he had taken over Hale Properties from a father who had built it as a luxury residential developer and wasn't entirely at peace with what Gideon had turned it into. Mixed-use, arts-focused, community-adjacent in ways his father found soft. He learned that Calloway Floral had been her idea, her risk, and her responsibility for 4 years, that she'd started it with a lease she couldn't quite afford and a wholesale account she'd earned by showing up every week for 6 months before anyone took her seriously. "You don't wait for permission," he said in one of the Tuesday calls. "Waiting doesn't get the flowers arranged," she said. "No, it doesn't." The Whitmore Center Spring Gala was 2 weeks out when Penny showed up at the shop on a Wednesday morning with the coffee, and the expression she wore when she had information that she'd been told not to share but found morally impossible to withhold. "Okay," she said, setting the coffee down. "I heard something." Sloane looked up from the order sheets. "I have a friend," Penny said carefully, "who works at a venue management company that consults with Hale Properties on event bookings. And she told me, and this is secondhand, that Craig Denton apparently told some people at a property management meeting that you and Gideon Hale had a personal arrangement. His words, and that the Whitmore contract was a, and again his words, favor. The word landed in the shop the way certain words do. Flat, without cushion. He was removed from that property," Sloane said. "I know, but some of those people are still at other Hale Properties, and they talk." Penny wrapped both hands around her own coffee cup. "I just thought you should know that it's out there." Sloane looked at the order sheets for a long moment. 4 arrangements for a corporate delivery at 11. 2 sympathy wreaths at 1. The gala prep starting Thursday. "When did Denton say this?" she asked. "About 3 weeks ago, before he was reassigned, which meant before Gideon had made any of his calls, before the gala confirmation. While the vendor review was still technically open, the timing was the thing. 3 weeks ago, Denton had been building a version of events, and then Gideon had moved, but the story Denton had already told was still circulating in rooms she wasn't in." Sloane pulled out her phone. She called Gideon. He picked up on the second ring. "Craig Denton told people at a property management meeting that my Whitmore contract was a personal favor," she said, "before he was reassigned. I need you to know I'm aware of that." A pause, the kind she had learned to read. "Where did you hear this?" "That doesn't matter. What matters is whether anyone with authority in your organization believes it." "Sloane, I'm not asking for reassurance," she said. "I'm asking for information. Because there's a difference between a problem that's been corrected and a story that's already in circulation, and those require different responses. She heard him take a breath. "You're right," he said, "and you deserved to know before I addressed it. I'm sorry you found out this way. What are you going to do about it?" "I already have an all-properties communication going out Friday about the vendor assessment process and the Whitmore Center contract specifically. It's framed around process clarity, but the subtext will be clear to anyone paying attention. That addresses the process. It doesn't address the personal arrangement claim." "No," he said, "it doesn't." A pause. "What would you like me to do?" The question surprised her. Not because it was unreasonable, but because she hadn't expected to be asked. She looked out the shop window. A delivery truck was double-parked outside, and the driver was arguing cheerfully with a parking officer who appeared to be winning. "I want the work to speak for itself," she said. "So I need the gala to be undeniable. I need every person in a Hale-managed property who attends that event to walk in and understand why Calloway Floral has held that contract for 3 years. The work already does that," he said. "Then let it do it loudly," she said. "No interference, no special placement, no anything that looks like it came from you. Just the work." Agreed. A brief silence. "And after the gala? After the gala, we'll see what the numbers say." He was quiet for a moment. "You're very good at drawing lines. I've had to be, I know." His voice was quieter. "That's one of the things He stopped. Started again. "I'll make sure the Friday communication is clear and I'll call you after the gala." "You can call before," she said. "About the project." "Yes," he said, "about the project." She hung up. Penny was watching from across the counter with the expression of someone who had witnessed something she was going to think about for a while. "That was very composed," Penny said. "I'm always composed." "You put your coffee down before you called him." "You never put your coffee down." Sloane picked her coffee back up. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. The Friday communication from Hale Properties went out as promised. She didn't see it directly, but Audra called to mention it and described it as unusually specific for a process memo, which told her what she needed to know. Gala week arrived the way it always did, with more tasks than hours and a floral cold room that had been reorganized 3 times by Thursday night. The white peonies came in from the West Coast farm on a Tuesday morning, and Sloane was at the wholesale dock at 5:30 to receive them herself, because she trusted her hands more than anyone else's with something she'd ordered 4 months out. Penny found her at the dock with 2 coffees and said, "He's going to be there Saturday, I know. Are you going to be okay with that?" Sloane checked a stem. "I've been okay with him being in the same room as me since February. Nothing has changed." "A lot has changed." "The flowers are the same," Sloane said. "That's what matters Saturday." Saturday was the first night of the year that felt genuinely like spring. The Whitmore Center had a line out the door by 7, which was earlier than usual, which meant the weather and the publicity team had both done their jobs. Sloane arrived at 4 to supervise the setup and spent 3 hours making sure that by the time the doors opened, every arrangement was exactly where it needed to be, and every orchid installation she'd spent a week building was secured, lit, and alive in the way she needed it to be. By 7:15, she was standing near the back of the main hall watching people walk in. They stopped. Not all of them, but enough. The couples who came in from the cold and caught the east windows and the white peonies banked against them and actually stopped moving for a moment. The woman in the blue coat who touched a bloom on the end of the nearest table and then looked up at the room and said something to her companion that Sloane couldn't hear but could read as wonder. The 97 out of 100 was going to hold. She knew it in the way she always knew, not from the scores but from the room. The peonies were the right call. She didn't turn. She'd heard him come in. The ranunculus would have been prettier, she said. But peonies last. In a 3-hour event, the difference matters. Gideon stood beside her. He was looking at the room, not at her, which was how they'd learned to stand together, side by side with a view of whatever the thing was. "The installation by the east wall," he said. "The orchids?" "Yes, it looks like the building itself is growing something." She looked at it. It did look like that. The white orchids climbing the exposed ductwork, the roots of the installation visible in a way she'd left intentional, the old brick behind them. Like something alive in an old body. "That's what I was going for," she said. They stood there for a moment. Around them the event found its rhythm, the soft music, the rising conversation, the particular sound of people who are somewhere beautiful and know it. "I owe you a conversation," he said. "You've had several opportunities, I know. I wanted to wait until after this." He gestured at the room. "Until it was clear the work stood on its own." "Yes." A pause. "And because I wanted to say it somewhere that wasn't a phone call or a meeting room." Sloane looked at him. He was looking at the orchids. "I was not looking for a florist when I introduced myself at the February preview," he said. "I was interested in someone I watched de-escalate a ridiculous situation at the check-in table, with a calm I haven't seen outside of negotiations I've paid a lot of money to be part of. And then I found out she was the one who made the room look the way it did." Sloane didn't say anything. "I should have been more careful," he continued, "about the ways I reached out, about what Craig read into it and what I didn't anticipate. You had to handle the consequences of something I set in motion without thinking it through." He looked at her. "I'm sorry for that. You moved quickly when it mattered," she said. "That was the minimum, I know. I'm saying it wasn't nothing." He held her gaze for a moment. The gala continued around them, warm and humming. "The textile factory opens in June," he said. "Hale Properties would like Calloway Floral to design the permanent floral program, not for the gala, for the space itself. Standing arrangement, quarterly rotations, event consultation." Sloane looked at him. "That's a real contract, yes. Through official channels, already drafted," he said. "It'll be in your inbox Monday morning." She looked back at the room. The woman in the blue coat was laughing at something now, her hand still near the end table, still in proximity to the peonies. "I'll review it Monday," Sloane said. "And after you review it, I'll probably have notes." He almost smiled. "I'd expect nothing else." Around them, the room continued to do exactly what a room was supposed to do when the decisions had been right. Nobody noticed the florist and the building owner standing near the back of the hall. Nobody needed to. The flowers were doing the work they'd been put there to do. "Your drink," Sloane said, "is the sparkling water. The bar isn't serving until 7:30. Gideon looked at her. "A beat." "I know," he said. "I asked early." She shook her head, the way you shake your head at something that is absurd and familiar and not quite a surprise. "I have rounds to do," she said. "Go," he said. "I'll be here." She moved through the gala with her clipboard and her radio and the professional calm she had built over 4 years of doing the work the right way. She checked the installations. She confirmed the timeline. She said thank you to Audra and meant it. And when she left at 10:15 with the event still going strong, she passed Gideon on her way out. He was in a conversation with 2 people she didn't know, and he looked up as she crossed the room, and something passed between them that didn't need words. The work had spoken. The rest could follow in its own time. Monday morning, the contract was in her inbox, as promised. She read every line. She had 3 notes. She sent them. The reply came in 20 minutes, all 3 accepted. "We'll finalize Thursday." Penny read it over her shoulder and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "I knew it since the ranunculus." Sloane looked up. "The ranunculus? At the market. You bought extra. You never buy extra unless you're thinking about something." Penny picked up the tape gun with the serenity of someone who had been right about something for a while and was simply now able to say so. "You were thinking about him." Sloane looked at the email on her screen. The 3 acceptances, the Thursday meeting, the beginning of something that had been built carefully from the ground up, the way things that are meant to hold weight should be built. "The flowers," she said, "needed the extra eucalyptus." "Of course they did," Penny said. And outside the shop window, the first real morning of spring was doing exactly what it always did, arriving without announcement, without ceremony, as if it had simply been waiting for the room to be ready.